look at these very quick numbers. After the Second World War, if you look at battle deaths that have taken place in 25 interstate wars, that are approximately of the order of 3.3 million. In contrast, if you look at the approximately 120 civil wars which have happened in 73 states, many of them ongoing at the turn of the century, we are looking at over 16 million people dead. So the numbers are extremely high relative to interstate wars, right? And these numbers, of course, are not counting, deaths from displacement or disease or any other indirect effects of war. These numbers are good enough for me, but if you're interested in the economic costs of conflict, then they're of the order of 8% of GDP per year. But I don't think we need to go to the economics to appreciate that these numbers are very high. So I want to talk about intra-society conflicts today, and of course there are many aspects to this problem. And in a brief talk, I can only talk about one or two aspects of this. To me, it's a little bit like entering the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, right? There are 20 gates, right? And we have to go through one of them, and let's see what we can pick up from that. So there are many aspects of this that I've been working on. One is the empirics of conflict. So thinking about what are the important correlates of conflict, what measurable variables correlate with types of conflict. And today, well, I'll get to that in a bit, and then one can talk about theories of conflict, and there are many aspects of this that one can work on. And likewise, there are theories of aggressors and victims. Who are the people who have actually carried out overt acts of violence, and who are the people who have lost conflict? But today I'm going to just pick out little bits and pieces from here and try to focus on them. So one thing I want to do is talk quite a bit about the empirics of conflict. I want to talk about in particular the idea of ethnicity and how it relates to conflict. And for an economist, it's very strange to focus on ethnicity when she should be focusing on economic variables. But in my view, ethnic conflict is an extremely important aspect of economic conflict, and I'll talk more about that in detail. On theories of conflict, again, there are several issues, but what I want to focus on is I'm going to propose a particular distributional measure, and I'm going to try and show you a simple behavioral model that links conflict outcomes to distribution. So this will be a bit of economic theory. Some of you may like it, some of you may hate it, but in any case, we'll see what it looks like. Okay. And finally, here, I want to tell you about very recent work I've been doing on Hindu-Muslim conflict in India, and this is a topic of very great emotional and intellectual interest for me. I wish I could say something about Turkey. I know that the topic is equally important, but I know very little about it, so maybe you guys will tell me, and maybe some of these ideas can be translated to the Turkish context. I don't know, okay? But the Indian context is very important. So let me start by talking a little bit about the determinants of conflict. And especially ethnicity and various distribution variables. So here is one of the quotations that really attracted me to the subject, okay, by Donald Horowitz. It says, the Marxian concept of class as an inherited affiliation finds no support in the data. Marx's conception applies with far less distortion to ethnic groups. And he says, in much of Asia and Africa, it is only modest hyperbole to assert that the Marxian prophecy has had an ethnic fulfillment. And I think this is a very important point, because especially when I look at India, right? India has a huge amount of inequality. And one would expect that most of the conflict in India, internal conflict, would take place along class lines, right? The poor against the rich. The typical Marxian dichotomy, right? But we don't see that. Instead, we see conflicts taking place along very different cuts in the society, okay? Either caste or ethnicity of various kinds, or religion. And I think this is a really very important question. The first question that jumps up. And of course, there are many Orientalists whose work I don't necessarily subscribe to, who have actually taken this view, most notably people like Huntington, who argued that all the conflict in society can be viewed as a clash of cultures. Okay? That cultures are fundamental to thinking about conflict. And I make very clear that my position is not the same as Huntington's. Okay? But nevertheless, I believe at the same time that a lot of conflict is marked along non-economic lines. So the Huntington view, I guess, which one might call cultural fundamentalism, okay? So the Hindus are fundamentally somehow different from Muslims, right? This would be what the anthropologists would call a primordialist view of conflict, which is that there are these ancient hatreds between groups which may lie dormant most of the time, but from time to time they just reappear, okay? Well, they're fueled by some rumor or by legend or by a particular incident and so forth, right? And that should be contrasted with another view of ethnic conflict, which is we can call instrumentalism, okay? Which is that ethnicity, in the broader sense, including religion, right, is just a marker, is just a way of creating a me and a you, right, for extracting economic surplus. Right? And that is the particular view that I subscribe to, which is very different. Both of them deal with ethnic conflict, okay, but they come from very different viewpoints. Now, of course, we could discuss this for days, right, because there's so many things to discuss here, right? But there is a more basic question that jumps out first. Well, is it true at all that ethnicity matters for conflict? Now, this is a very broad question, right? So let me make it a little bit more specific. Okay? So what I want to know is that in a society with more ethnic divisions, whereby the word more, I'm not saying anything else except putting it in inverted commas, is a society with more ethnic divisions more prone to conflict? Now, there are two ways to actually approach this question. One is, of course, you can do historical studies of conflicts, one by one, right? And this is really what people like Donald Horowitz do. And everybody in this room, if you haven't read Horowitz, you should run out and buy a copy and read it, because he's just a wonderful writer, and the details of conflict and his general insights are very important. But there's a bit of a wood for the trees problem. Everything is so complex that you can't really get general themes out of reading Horowitz. You can get a lot of knowledge, but general ideas are hard to come by. So then, on the other side, you will find the economists, who are, of course, much more boring, okay, because they're doing statistical stuff, econometric stuff, okay? So the two has to go together in some sense. But the statistical approach would be essentially to run a regression, okay? You put some indicators of conflict on one side and distributional variables on the other and see if there's a connection. So here's a typical test that economists would carry out. I include among these political scientists as well, right? So sort of empirical social scientists. Okay? So there's many measures of conflict. You can use demonstrations, processions, strikes, riots, casualties, or deaths in civil war, right? So you put that on the left-hand side of an equation, right? And on the right-hand side, well, let me not go to the left-hand side, let me just, right-hand side here, let me just point out that even if you make a specific choice here, there's lots of issues about exactly how you define these things, okay? And in the interest of all of us not falling asleep at the same time, I won't go into the details of this. But people are seriously concerned about whether you define a civil war by 25 battle deaths in a year or 1,000 battle deaths in a year. And these are very important questions. And in fact, the Peace Research Institute at Oslo has been doing very important work on this. But I will bypass that. Let's suppose we have some definition. And then on the other side of that equation will come a group of explanatory variables. Okay? So there'll be your usual suspects, right? The economic variables, per capita income, the quality of income, and so forth. There'll be geographical variables, like how uneven the terrain is. Okay? There'll be political variables, the effect of democracy. A lot of these are hard to measure, but anyway, they're there, right? And of course, from my point of view, what I'm interested in here today, there'll be the ethnic variable, okay? Now, what is the ethnic variable that's typically used? Okay? So what happens is, there's this whole set of encyclopedias really starting from this one, from the old Soviet Union, the Atlas Narodov Mira, right? Which put together ethno-linguistic groupings in different societies. Okay? And these are done partly by ethnic origin, partly by linguistic commonality. Okay? So for example, think about the ethnic group of Turks. What does that mean, right? If you just do it from an ethnic perspective, there are many subgroups, right? But if you do it from an ethno-linguistic perspective, then there may be a greater degree of commonality. So there's data which is drawn typically from these sources, both on ethno-linguistic diversity and on religious diversity. diversity. And then you have to combine this mess of data into a particular index that will capture how diverse ethnicity is. And the measure that's used a lot is called the ethnic, it's a very big term, but it's a very simple formula. It's called the ethno-linguistic fractionalization. It's a way of figuring out how fragmented a society is. And very quickly, I'll put up the term for you. So imagine that there are M groups in society, and Nj is the population share of group J. Okay? Then imagine picking up 2 people at random from the society and asking yourself, what is the probability that these 2 people come from 2 different groups? Okay? Well, the probability that this guy comes from group J is Nj, but the second guy has to come from somewhere else, so it's multiplied by 1 minus Nj, and then you add it up overall. And that's the overall average probability that when you pick 2 people at random, they belong to 2 different groups. Okay? And this index, which I'll call F for fractionalization, is a measure of how diverse the society is. This index will go up if there are lots of different groups in society. Now, it turns out that for those of you interested in economics, that the fractionalization index is actually a special case of a very well-known measure called the Gini coefficient. Okay? I'll just put that up over there. Gini. So this index is something that's widely used in empirical work. Okay, on conflict. And here's a list of references for how widely it's used. But the interesting thing is that it shows no correlation at all with conflict. Okay? So there's a bunch of papers that have come to this conclusion that there is no correlation at all between this index of ethnic diversity, okay, and the extent of conflict. So it almost seems like the anthropologists are not getting off the ground. Even though Horowitz and all are all writing about ethnic conflict, it seems that ethnic diversity statistically is not correlated. Okay, so here's an example. Here's a quotation from Fearon and Layton. It says that the estimates for the effect of ethnic and religious fractionalization are substantively and statistically insignificant. The empirical pattern is thus inconsistent with the common expectation that ethnic diversity is a major and direct cause of civil violence. Okay? So that's what the statisticians have concluded. Okay? In contrast, I'm continuing to quote from Fearon and Layton, per capita income is strongly significant in both a statistical and a substantive sense. Okay? So it seems that higher per capita income lowers conflict. Okay? But this ethnic diversity stuff doesn't seem to work. Okay? That's the kind of stuff. And the per capita income has been, well, let me not go into detail there, but various aspects of that have been studied, but this is not my main focus today. I want to stick